proudly showing off a custom $165,000 home theater system they'd built exclusively for my sister's kids. My mother swirled her wine, laughing as she told me they'd funded it by selling off my 10-year-old daughter Lily's inheritance, a collection of rare, vintage books left to her by my late great-grandmother. They expected me to scream. They expected me to break down in tears over the ultimate betrayal of my own flesh and blood. Instead, I just looked around the lavish room, took a slow sip of my water, and smiled. I looked my mother dead in the eyes and said, "I'm glad you enjoy the screen, because those books were..." The smug grin completely vanished from my father's face as his lawyer, who was standing by the door, turned violently pale. They thought they had won. They had no idea they'd just signed their own financial death warrants. My name is Mary. I am 26 years old, and for a long time, I believed that family was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where love was given freely, not measured out in dollars and cents. But in my family, everything carried a price tag, and affection was a currency reserved entirely for the golden child. My older sister, Vanessa, could do no wrong in the eyes of our parents, Richard and Eleanor. While I worked double shifts as a single mother to provide a stable life for my 10-year-old daughter, Lily, Vanessa lived a life of luxury funded almost entirely by my parents' endless generosity. Her children were showered with expensive gadgets and designer clothes, while Lily and I were treated like minor inconveniences, tolerated only during mandatory holiday dinners. The blatant favoritism reached a breaking point when my late great-grandmother, Evelyn, passed away. Evelyn was the only person who truly saw through the shallow, greedy exterior of our family. Before she left this world, she bypassed my parents and Vanessa entirely, leaving her most prized possession directly to Lily, a massive, decades-old collection of rare literature and pristine, leather-bound first editions. When the heavy wooden crates arrived at my parents' house for temporary storage, Richard and Eleanor openly sneered at them. My mother scoffed, calling the priceless heirlooms nothing more than dusty old paper that was cluttering up her pristine space. They saw no value in history, art, or a dying woman's love. They wanted cash, and they despised the fact that a 10-year-old girl now held the only real legacy Evelyn had left behind. The following weekend, I had to work a grueling 12-hour double shift at the hospital. Left with no other choice, I asked my parents if Lily could stay with them for those 2 days. They agreed, though my mother made sure to sigh heavily over the phone to remind me just how much of an inconvenience we were. When I finally drove up their pristine, circular driveway on Sunday evening to pick up my daughter, a strange, hollow feeling settled deep inside my stomach. While Lily was upstairs packing her small overnight bag, I decided to head up to the climate-controlled attic to check on great-grandmother Evelyn's book collection. I wanted to map out a plan to slowly move the heavy crates into our modest apartment. But when I pushed open the heavy attic door, my heart stopped. The corner where the massive wooden crates had been safely stacked was completely bare. There was nothing left but dust outlines on the hardwood floor. Panicked, I rushed downstairs to the living room, where Richard and Eleanor were waiting for me. Before I could even open my mouth to ask about the missing crates, my mother clapped her hands together with a brilliant, artificial smile. She enthusiastically announced that they were hosting a mandatory family dinner to celebrate a massive, life-changing surprise. She led me down the hallway to what used to be the guest wing. With a theatrical flourish, my father threw open the double doors to reveal a breathtaking, ultra-luxury home theater room, complete with plush leather recliners and a massive, state-of-the-art projector screen. Vanessa's children were already inside, eating popcorn and laughing loudly. Eleanor leaned close to me, her voice dripping with smug satisfaction as she casually confessed that an elite estate buyer had offered them $165,000 cash for Lily's collection. Since the boxes were sitting on their property, they decided to spend the money on a real, modern investment for the family bloodline. I didn't yell. I didn't let a single tear fall, nor did I give them the satisfaction of seeing me break down. My parents and Vanessa watched me closely, their faces twisted into smug, expectant grins, practically begging for me to throw a tantrum so they could label me as the jealous, ungrateful sister. Instead, I quietly took a deep breath, consciously smoothing my expression into a mask of pure calmness, mirroring the precise emotional detachment I had learned to master over years of handling their cruelty. As I stood there staring at the glittering, high-tech theater room, my mind flashed back to a rainy afternoon 6 months ago. I was sitting at great-grandmother Evelyn's bedside during her final days. She had held my hand with surprising strength, her sharp eyes completely lucid despite her failing body. She told me she knew exactly what kind of vultures Richard and Eleanor were, and she explicitly warned me that their unquenchable greed would eventually drive them to look for a way to exploit her passing. Evelyn wasn't just a passive lover of old literature. She was an extraordinarily brilliant and meticulous woman who spent her life quietly outmaneuvering the superficial people around her. She revealed to me that she had designed a brilliant safeguard. The true, astronomical value of her inheritance didn't lie in the external antique market value of the physical ink and paper they had just sold off. The real wealth, the life-changing secret, was ingeniously hidden inside a very specific, locked subset of the collection. Tucked securely inside the hollowed-out bindings of her classic poetry books were original asset ledgers, certified financial deeds, and private legal instructions that changed absolutely everything. Bringing my thoughts back to the brightly lit home theater room, I slowly looked around at the expensive speakers, the plush leather seating, and the vibrant projector screen. My mother was still swirling her wine glass, waiting for the predictable explosion that never came. I looked her dead in the eyes, tilted my head slightly, and delivered the shocking punchline that would alter the course of their lives forever. "I'm genuinely glad you enjoy this massive screen," I said, my voice eerily calm, "because those books you just sold were actually the legal keys to this entire property." The smug, self-satisfied grin completely vanished from my father's face. Behind him, standing near the entrance of the room, was Mr. Henderson, the family's longtime estate lawyer. He had been invited that evening to finalize a completely separate property transfer for Vanessa, but as my words echoed through the room, his face turned violently pale. He dropped his folder onto a nearby chair, his hands visibly shaking as he realized the legal catastrophe that had just unfolded. I calmly explained what great-grandmother Evelyn had done 6 weeks before her passing. The physical books didn't legally belong to Evelyn anymore when she died, nor were they simple hand-me-downs. She had already legally transferred the ownership of the entire family estate, including the very ground my parents were standing on, into an irrevocable trust explicitly under Lily's name. The physical book collection itself served as the official, contractually mandated token of transfer and legal key. By selling that collection illegally to an outside buyer without the trust's permission, Richard and Eleanor hadn't just made a parenting mistake. They had committed massive grand larceny and real estate fraud. Total panic immediately set in, shattering the celebratory atmosphere of the room. Within less than 24 hours, the reality of their actions began to catch up with them in the most brutal way possible. The elite private estate buyer they had dealt with was a highly professional collector who immediately ran a routine authentication check on the rare books. The moment he attempted to log the purchase, the items were instantly flagged by the digital tracking system of Lily's legal trust, triggering an automatic alert for stolen high-value property. Terrified of being dragged into a major felony investigation, the furious buyer contacted my father, demanding the immediate return of his $165,000 cash. He gave them a strict 48-hour ultimatum, threatening to go straight to the police with charges of fraud and grand larceny if the money wasn't safely back in his account. But Richard and Eleanor were trapped. The entire $165,000 was already completely gone, poured into the non-refundable, custom-built construction, structural remodeling, and high-end technological installations of the theater room. Desperate, my mother turned to Vanessa, practically begging her to liquidate some of her own assets or take out a quick loan to save them from impending arrest. Vanessa's artificial mask of family loyalty vanished instantly. Realizing her parents were no longer a financial resource but a legal liability, she coldly refused to help, claiming she couldn't jeopardize her own children's future for their foolish mistake. The illusion of their perfect, unified family dynamic shattered right before their eyes, leaving my parents entirely isolated in the middle of their expensive, useless theater. I didn't let them stew in their panic for long. The very next morning, I hired a brilliant, sharp estate attorney who specialized in high-stakes trust fraud. We arranged a formal meeting back at my parents' house, sitting right in that useless, silent home theater room. Instead of immediately calling the police and sending my own flesh and blood to a federal prison for grand larceny, I sat across from them, laced my fingers together, and calmly offered a cold, calculated alternative. I was going to give them exactly one chance to save themselves from absolute ruin. My attorney laid out the strict terms of our surrender agreement on the glass table. To completely avoid immediate criminal prosecution and a guaranteed prison sentence for grand larceny, fraud, and the blatant theft of a minor's inheritance, Richard and Eleanor had to make a massive sacrifice. They were required to legally sign over the absolute deeds of their remaining personal properties and investments directly into Lily's irrevocable trust. Furthermore, they had to sign an ironclad clause that legally dissolved any future claims, rights, or interference with any branch of the family assets ever again. They had absolutely no leverage left to negotiate. With trembling hands and tears of bitter regret streaming down my mother's face, my parents slowly picked up the pen and signed every single page. They were forced to continue living in the very house they once proudly thought they owned, but with one humiliating catch. They were now technically rent-free tenants completely at the mercy of the 10-year-old granddaughter they had tried to rob. 6 months have passed since that final meeting, and our lives have transformed completely. Lily's financial future is now entirely secured by the ironclad trust assets left behind by great-grandmother Evelyn. Vanessa's family completely drifted away the moment the money dried up, and that expensive home theater system now sits entirely quiet, dark, and unused, a glittering monument to their own greed. It is amazing how blinding selfishness can be, making intelligent people orchestrate their very own destruction. Now, I am incredibly curious about all of you who have followed my journey until the very end. What would you have done if you were standing in my shoes? Have you ever experienced? Comment your thoughts below, and please mention the city you are watching from so I can see how far Lily's story has traveled across the world. The look of absolute shock on a greedy person's face when the tables turn is something you never forget. I am leaving 2 other incredible, high-stakes storytelling favorites on the final screen right now that will definitely surprise you. Thank you so much for watching,